A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here, and we can do it here.
Canada's agriculture sector is already being hammered by China, with a 100% duty on canola and a 25% levy on pork donna, but a fertilizer tariff would likely be different, since the Americans are so reliant on buying Canadian potash.
Canada and the United States are entering a new and uneasy chapter in their trade relationship, and the latest flashpoint is fertilizer. At first glance, fertilizer may seem like a narrow agricultural issue, but it is actually a window into something much deeper: the political economy of dependency, the imbalance of power between neighbors, and the way a country can be rich in resources yet poor in sovereignty. Recent reporting from U.S. agricultural policy circles described the Trump administration as considering what officials called very severe tariffs on Canadian nitrogen and potash. These are not marginal goods. They are the backbone of North American food production. And any disruption immediately ripples into farm costs, food prices, and global supply chains. Fertilizer is one of those strategic commodities that quietly holds entire economies together, and when it becomes a bargaining chip, the consequences extend far beyond agriculture. American officials have framed the move as a way to protect U.S. farmers from what they describe as unfair competition. But agricultural economists interviewed in the same reports argue that the real driver is political pressure from domestic farm lobbies who want Washington to weaponize trade tools to secure a market advantage. This is a familiar pattern in U.S. trade behavior, where tariffs are used not only as economic instruments but as political signals. The fertilizer tariff threat fits neatly into this pattern, revealing how domestic politics can reshape international trade in ways that appear technical on the surface but are deeply political underneath. It also exposes how a powerful country can use trade tools to shape outcomes for a smaller partner, even when that partner is wealthy. Canada's response has been cautious but firm. Statements from its trade ministry warn that Ottawa will respond proportionately if the tariffs are imposed, signaling that retaliation is already on the table. But Canada's options are limited. Its economy is deeply integrated with the United States, and diversification away from the American market is slow, costly, and constrained by geography. Trade experts quoted in Canadian media have described the situation as a reminder of the asymmetry in the relationship. This asymmetry is not just economic, it is structural. Canada is a country rich in resources, but its sovereignty in trade matters is often overshadowed by the gravitational pull of its dominant neighbor. This is the essence of a smaller, rich, yet poor country. Rich in assets, poor in leverage. The fertilizer dispute also comes at a moment when both countries are preparing to reopen formal trade talks early next year. Canadian officials have said the negotiations will focus on stabilizing the relationship after months of tariff threats and countermeasures. Yet the fertilizer issue shows how fragile that stability is. When a strategic commodity becomes a bargaining chip, diplomacy becomes harder, not easier. Negotiations that were supposed to rebuild trust now risk being overshadowed by a dispute that touches the core of both countries' agricultural sectors. This is why the fertilizer issue is not just a trade story, it is a geopolitical story, one that reveals the deeper tensions shaping North American integration and the limits of Canadian sovereignty within it. The fertilizer sector is especially sensitive because Canada is one of the world's largest producers of potash, and the United States depends heavily on Canadian supply. Analysts quoted in recent policy briefings have warned that tariffs could raise production costs for American farmers at a time when global food inflation remains high. The U.S. government has already announced a multi-billion-dollar relief package for farmers, a move critics say amounts to subsidizing the consequences of its own trade aggression. This pattern, impose tariffs, trigger domestic harm, then subsidize the affected sector, has become a recurring feature of U.S. trade policy. It is a cycle that reinforces dependency on government support while destabilizing international markets. And it shows how the United States can absorb the cost of its own actions in ways Canada cannot. For Canada, the challenge is not just economic but strategic. Its agricultural sector relies on access to the U.S. market, and any disruption threatens both producers and consumers. Canadian officials have emphasized the importance of maintaining stable supply chains, but stability is difficult when the larger partner in the relationship uses trade tools unpredictably. This unpredictability is part of a broader shift in U.S. trade policy, where tariffs are increasingly used as a first resort rather than a last one. The fertilizer dispute is simply the latest example of this shift, and it raises questions about the future of North American economic cooperation. It also raises questions about how much sovereignty a country truly has when its economic lifelines run through a single border. The implications extend beyond agriculture. When a commodity as essential as fertilizer becomes a point of contention, it signals deeper tensions in the political economy of the region. It suggests that the old model of cooperation, where both countries benefited from integrated supply chains and predictable trade rules, may be giving way to a more confrontational era. Analysts have described this shift as a move from partnership to rivalry, driven by domestic political pressures and a changing global landscape. In this context, the fertilizer dispute is not an isolated event but part of a broader pattern of trade weaponization. And Canada, despite its wealth, finds itself in a position similar to many countries in the global south, structurally dependent, politically constrained, and economically vulnerable. This pattern is not unique to North America. Around the world, powerful economies are increasingly using trade tools to assert influence, protect domestic industries, and shape global markets. Smaller and mid-sized economies often find themselves caught in the middle, forced to navigate a landscape where economic decisions are inseparable from political considerations. Canada's position in the fertilizer dispute mirrors the challenges faced by many countries that are rich in resources but poor in leverage. The difference is that Canada is rarely framed this way in mainstream narratives. It is presented as a partner, an ally, a peer. But the structure of the relationship tells a different story, one of dependency, asymmetry, and constrained sovereignty. The fertilizer dispute also raises questions about food security. Fertilizer is a critical input in global agriculture, and disruptions in supply can lead to higher food prices, reduced yields, and increased volatility in global markets. Experts have warned that trade tensions involving fertilizer could exacerbate existing challenges in the global food system, which is already under pressure from climate change, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical conflict. In this sense, the Canada-US dispute is not just a bilateral issue, it is part of a larger story about the fragility of global food systems and the risks posed by politicized trade. It is also a reminder that even wealthy countries can be vulnerable when their economic sovereignty is limited. As the new year approaches, the question is not only whether the United States will impose the tariffs but what this escalation signals about the future of North American trade. If fertilizer becomes a test case for more aggressive U.S. trade policy, then the old model of cooperation may be giving way to a more confrontational era. For countries that rely on the United States economically, the implications will be felt far beyond the farm fields. The fertilizer dispute is a reminder that trade is never just about goods and services, it is about power, politics, and the structures that shape global economic relationships. And Canada, despite its wealth, remains a smaller country navigating the gravitational pull of a much larger one. This moment offers an opportunity to rethink the assumptions that have guided North American trade for decades. It invites a deeper examination of how power operates in the global economy and how countries can build more resilient and equitable trade relationships. For Canada, the challenge is to navigate this shifting landscape while protecting its economic interests and maintaining stability in key sectors. For the United States, the challenge is to balance domestic political pressures with the need for stable and predictable trade relationships. And for the rest of the world, the Canada-US fertilizer dispute is a case study in how trade tensions in one region can have far-reaching consequences, especially for countries that are rich in resources but structurally poor in sovereignty. If you enjoyed this, like, comment, subscribe, and share. This is Liberation Lens. And perspective has never mattered more. Join us in the next.